I'm here today to talk to you about storytelling in the age of JavaScript. And I'm a storyteller. I am a designer and a developer for the web, and you probably are as well. You're telling stories on the web, and that's why you're here. So let's dig into that a little bit. So why is storytelling important? During this talk, we're going to talk about storytelling on the web, and we'll go over some concrete examples to get you going, and talk about some general options for how to tell a good story on the web. I'm going to put my laptop up here like Aaron did. He's, a trendsetter, so. All right, so why is storytelling important? Storytelling is a fundamental piece of humanity. Our earliest records of humans all involve people telling stories to each other. Part of the reason for this is because our biology rewards us for being curious. We're like, what's in that bush? Do we have to run away from it? Are we going to eat it later? We get a dopamine rush from hearing stories. Story also allows us to plan for the future. We can safely see possible scenarios that might be dangerous for us and subconsciously prepare. For these reasons, we crave story. We leave work on a stressful day and we turn on Netflix, or we go to a bar and we tell stories to each other. So in storytelling and in building websites, we have something called the so what factor. People start off intrigued, but that curiosity is finite. We know that user attention span is short, and we have about 2 seconds before it completely drops off. Amazon's discovered that for every 1 second delay, conversions drop by 7%. Walmart has found that it gains 1% revenue increase for every 100 milliseconds of improvement. And some of you might be familiar with journey maps on a website, but in case you aren't, here's an example of walking through the process of being a visitor on your own site and what that looks like from the point of view for the user. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be framed within that kind of journey. Now, usually we talk about the drop-offs in terms of performance, how fast our sites load to keep our interest, and this is really important. But I would argue that it's equally important that we talk about this window of time in terms of sustained curiosity. Your site could be the fastest loading site on the internet, but if it's not ultimately compelling, people will go. The inverse is true too, right? You can tell the greatest story online, but if it doesn't load before the user attention fades, the story is never told. So these two things work in tandem. Now, that seems simple enough, so what are some of the things that are keeping us from telling great stories on the web? Well, some of the teams that we work on are siloed, so we have things where, we have a product page and a search page, and the two don't talk to each other about how a user transitions between one or the other. And even on those one pages, we're not totally aligned sometimes. Product wants everybody to click on something, and design wants to make things look cohesive and well-branded, and engineering wants to reduce legacy code and work with a new framework. So even on that one page, sometimes things fall out of sync. But the user doesn't care about any of that, right? When you're a user on a site, you're not thinking about whether it looks like a dribble shot or if they're using the brand new framework. You're thinking, is this useful? Is it captivating? And is it easy enough? And this, going from point A to point B, like we saw in that user journey, that's actually your best case scenario. Most of the time that I go to a new website, I don't know why I'm there. It's blurry-eyed. I'm 6 in the morning. I got to take my puppy out. What is this? So that's actually your best case scenario, is someone who knows where they're going on your site. So one way of kind of aligning everything and making sure that you're doing the right things for your site is to start with the end. We can break down the ways that we can connect these states if we start with the end. And sometimes when you talk with your teams, you might think everybody's aligned to what the end goal is for the user, and they're not. That's one really simple way of saying oh, okay, maybe you thought it was the contact form and I thought it was the search page. So it also tracks what validation looks like. So I talk about spatial maps a lot. This is a heat map of an eye looking at one page. So one thing to note here is that your eye doesn't stay in one place. It moves around in an event called saccade, and it moves constantly. So you're trying to make a spatial map every time you visit a website. If you understand what the beginning of the goal is and what the end of the goal is, you can all of a sudden start to fill that space in between and make sure that there's not as many cognitive leaks and we're reducing friction for the user. So here's a great example from Code Drops where just choosing your seats in a movie theater, you get a real understanding of the experience ahead of you. You're looking through like the eyes of what it would be like in that theater, and it's much easier and it's much more clear to pick your seat and do that checkout experience. So the other thing to understand is that your user never looks like this. They're not smiling in a big bright room with like a fancy new laptop. Your user looks like this. They're holding a screaming infant, their boss just yelled at them, they're on the phone with PG&E. So understanding that they might not have the patience that you might think that they do. And it's our job to not expect that everything that we know is something that our users know also. It's not always immediately clear to them. We need to shine a light in a sea of features on what piece of the story that they might be most interested in. Okay, so we need to talk about how to offer clarity. Since we're considering how a user feels on your site, we have to consider the site's personality. Now you might be thinking, personality, my site's not a person, but hold the phone. Okay, so we're gonna go through some examples, and of course the first one is Clippy. So you remember Clippy? Of course you do. Clippy is like the be-all, end-all of bad UX examples, and people usually say it's because something popped up, but that's not the whole story there. Consider for a second that Clippy was a person, and every time you wrote a letter, this person came out and said like, hey, do you want help writing the letter? The first time they did that, it would be like a little annoying, but not so bad. But if every time you sat down to write a letter, this person was like, hey, do you want help writing a letter? And they never learned you and they never kind of understood what you were saying from the last time, that would be a really annoying person. And so again, you might be thinking, but my computer is not a person. But research shows that actually that might be true. One company used to do a yearly study of all of the software that they used at the company, and they had a separate computer that you'd go to and you'd talk about, ooh, I'm getting ahead of myself. They had a separate computer that employees used to take the survey. So 1 year, they figured out how to send this survey out to people's personal computers. And what they found was that they were all of a sudden reporting that the software was much higher quality. But the software hadn't changed at all. So what was happening was people started reporting that the software was okay because they were using the computer that the software was on. Now, if you ask those people, are you being nice to your computer? They'd say, no, of course not. I know my computer is not a person. But the more they dug into the study and all of the psychological effects, the more they understood that people weren't being honest with their computer because they thought it was rude. So if we go back to the Clippy model, we understand that Clippy was annoying because his personality was annoying. They ran tests where Clippy started to make fun of himself. He's like, oh my God, I'm here again. Why am I always here? You know, you should write a letter to Microsoft. You should really let them have it. And all of the reports showed that Clippy started to be a really likable person. People started to really like Clippy. So I think Smashing's magazine's new footer redesign is a perfect example of good personality. The cat is the mascot for Smashing. You can see here on the desktop view him pouncing towards the bird. And then when you scroll the window down, you see what might have happened to that bird. And anytime, this is really smart because anytime we feel an emotion, it attaches to our limbic system and makes it easier to remember and recall later. There's actually one screen size, Vitaly, the guy who does Smashing magazine, said where the bird escapes, but I haven't found it yet. So that's something that you can look for. I think Netflix is a great example of good and bad personality. Netflix tries to learn your interests through machine learning algorithms, but we get into these scenarios where if it knows you too well, it gives you some really bad things. Like I love horror films, so I watch like 3 horror films in a row, and then I watch a comedy, and now it only ever shows me Shaun of the Dead. So here's one user's account. This is like their hack is like making a Hattie and a drunk Hattie account, which I think is pretty good. But ideally, your user doesn't have to hack your system in order to make a good experience for themselves. So I made this like little Wall-E guy. I really like Wall-E. He's kind of interested in that cockroach there. So relatable stories create empathy. Anytime you show a character or show something that is a little bit more memorable, you start to think of yourself in those shoes. So perceived performance, this is a big reason why we do a lot of this stuff. Humans actually overestimate passive wait times by 36%. So that means that like every time you use timeline recordings or something to like measure how long something's taking, it's actually not telling you the full story. Your user could actually be feeling like it's way longer than that. Viget did a study where they had one custom loader and one kind of like drab, normal loader. And the custom loader just had their logo with 3 dots. And people were willing to wait twice as long for that custom loader because they felt like they weren't abandoned. So when we use a site, if we're waiting for that site to load or we're waiting for something to happen, what we found through MRI scans is that if you have to wait for over 4 seconds, you experience the same feeling that you do when you're watching a horror film. So that's really important to keep in mind. Uncertain wait times are longer than known finite wait, so progress bars are really important. Disney World and airports know things like this. Disney World shows you all those animatronic things while you're waiting in line. And airports actually make you walk a really long way to get to baggage claim, because then by the time you get there, you haven't been waiting that long and your bag has arrived. Doctors also do stuff like this. When you come to a doctor, you sit in the waiting room for a little while, and then they bring you into the exam room before they're ready to see you, because people feel like they're already on the doctor journey. So loaders are a really great case for SVG. I'm going to talk about SVG animation a little bit today. This is a really great one. I use this thing called Honey. It's an extension that finds discount codes online. But it takes a little while, right? It takes like a minute for them to find all these codes. So we've got this like cute little SVG animation. We've got our progress bar. We've got some testing codes. And I'm willing to wait for that experience, and I probably would have ditched out if it wasn't there. I made this loader for Smashing Magazine for their checkout experience, and it's not that amazing or anything, but the important thing to keep in mind is that entire graphic and the animation and everything was 6 kilobytes. So SVG is really, really good for these kind of use cases, especially when you need to load really, really fast. Another really important thing is foreshadowing or hints. We're going to talk about some like innovative ways to get people involved in your UI. One way to do that without losing your users is to let them know what the next thing is. And if we were using SVG, this is a demo that I made showing how to animate the view box. So this is just one SVG, and we have these little bloopy bits, that's the technical term, that lets people know where you can actually click on. So you can also see that it can constrain itself, and because it's SVG, it works on all devices, and it gets really, really small, very easy for responsive. Here's another example of like something that's a little bit more unusual. So they show you before you do anything what the ideal way of working with it is. So something that's really important to keep people invested is the element of surprise. I don't know if you guys ever saw the BBC interview with the kids that interrupt him. So timing is really important in that, it's kind of connected to surprise as well. If you see the little baby's legs moving forward, that's kind of like funny and cute. But if I change the timing even to like 2.2 seconds slower, it's not funny anymore. All of a sudden the baby's kind of like boringly walking across the thing. So even every little bit of timing is something that you should consider. And this is a little bit off topic, but I had the weirdest JavaScript error where the baby just kept coming out when he wasn't ready. So every time I'd like try to debug it, I'd be like, no, baby, no, not yet. So and if we're thinking about timing, we should be thinking about how things look to our user. So if you're on this Groupon site, we have a kind of dark UX pattern where the first time you see it and the first time it loads, it's already asking me for my information. It's like, come on, buy me a drink first, If you think I'm being picky, Google will actually lower your SEO points if you start to do these timed interstitials. So this is a documentary footage of me using that site. All right, so now we've kind of looked at some of the things that we should be using when we're telling a story on the site and why it's even important to do so, some theory. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty and look at some actual code. I'm not saying that these are the only ways that you can do this. This is just a couple of examples, but these are just here to get your fires burning. So if we're going to do something with surprise, which we just talked about, we need to know that we have to set up a world beforehand so that it can be changed. So I made that with SVG, and the way that it works is basically that I'm setting up this polygon world that you see for even just a few seconds before it starts to kind of move apart. And I'm doing this with SVG filters to kind of like break it apart in a way that SVG doesn't normally look, and that's kind of surprising. So SVG filters, however, can be a little performance insensitive, so we'll animate the base frequency of the filter, but I'm going to call these helper functions that allow me to set the filter to initially to 0 and then immediately remove the attribute as soon as it's done so that it's not affecting the performance of any of the rest of the animation. Another thing we talked about was creating a more seamless transition from the beginning of the end to the user journey. Identifying the end of the story and making sure that the transitions from one state to another happen as seamlessly as possible is really important. This example by Leo Lung shows a really nice seamless transition. It feels really nice. So in figuring out how to create that path for your users, you can create storyboards of your existing designs and try to find similar elements that can be simply altered with a transition instead of completely showing another view and breaking their context. So this is without transitions. You lose an opportunity. The user has to remap every interactive space, and it doesn't feel as fluid. It feels a little more clunky. So we're going to use the progressive framework view for a lot of these examples because I feel like they've done a really good job understanding transitions of state in a responsible, maintainable, declarative manner. Here we have two ways of describing what's changing. You have something that you can hook into, the enter and leave states. We even have that one hook for right before the transition, the hook for during the transition, and the hook for the end of the transition. And all of those pieces are optional. And aside from keeping the pieces consistent and granular, there are some nice pieces of sugars offered here, like in-out modes. What this lets us do is kind of schedule without saying we're scheduling. So we can say something like, does one transition waiting for the other to finish in order to fire? So in this example, it looks like one element, but it's actually two. One is going out and waiting for the other one to finish before flipping in. So usually you'd have to write it really imperatively, like steps, like when you're cooking something. That's pretty clunky and hacky developer experience. You have to write callbacks and things like that. So this is way more intuitive. And if you don't have in-out modes, it still works, but it just doesn't look and feel as nice. It just kind of flips into space. So here's what that transition component looks like. It's super simple and easy to read and maintain. We've got a transition component, an in-out mode, and we're using a slot here to replace the content, which allows us to reuse this component with plenty of defaults. So if we're working with our transition component, we plug into that enter active class hook that I mentioned before, and then we just state how we'd like it to work. So once we've encapsulated what's changing, we can do some really fun things here. So the entrance will always be consistent, as well as the exit. We can reuse these components. We can change their order. We can manage state in a really clean and simple manner. So we're encapsulating what's changing, and then we're hanging the animation off of that state. In this example, I'm not even passing the state around. I'm using a centralized store called Vuex, which is similar to Redux if you know React. And I can number these templates, toggle their visibility, and advance the state, which has all of that SVG animation logic. And we can also do this in React. So it's the same concept, right? We have basically like one idea of a screen, and then we're toggling through it, and we let React handle all of the state logic, and we let another library called GSAP handle all of the animation logic that hangs off of that in a synthetic event. We can also create animation with watchers and observables and RxJX. If things are similar enough, you can simply transition the state with watchers. Here I've built from scratch a chart with Vue. As the data changes, the watchers will update and simply transition between them. So again, that's how we did our little, Wall-E guy who's trying to find his cockroach.
Wow.
In Vue, we create a mouse move event in the HTML, and then in methods in JavaScript, we can plug in event values and use GreenSock Animation API's progress to plot along those values. Another way we can tell a story on a website is to create a fixed window narrative where the user isn't rerouting, but rather exploring something like WebGL or 3.js world. Patronus is a great example of this experience. It can be really powerful because you're engaging the user's emotion system while keeping them from having to use navigation systems like Dreams do. Using real-time data can be really powerful for telling stories. Here's a great example from 538 where you can drag different handles and change the subjective reality using real-time analytics. But beware that this kind of forecasting, when done wrong, can have the opposite effect as to not trust you. 538 became really addictive during the election for many people because it felt so real-time, but when the predictions were wrong, a lot of people kind of became disenchanted. So real-time data is insanely powerful this way, but you have to use it well and trust that the information is accurate enough. And Let's Free Congress is a great example of something called scrollytelling. It uses this scrollytelling method to hold the user's attention as well as pair graphics with concepts so that the user's curiosity is sustained and they also learn along that journey. And then we also have user interaction-driven sites that create a world. I particularly like this one because they guide you through it. Remember we were talking about those foreshadowing, so they have these little ways of letting you know what the next thing is, but it's still on brand, right? It still has that kind of cartoon, Macbeth feeling, and you have all sorts of ways of navigating this space, and it really complements the site. And here you can play a little piano and make lots of cool stuff happen. So what do we learn when we consider that our websites can be storytelling? We can think about how to get the user from here to there in an efficient way, but even if we can't connect those points so directly, we make the journey interesting enough along the way to keep them going. So in this talk, we discussed the most important aspects of building a well-functioning site, that in order to hit our goals, we must not only focus on performance, but also our user-sustained curiosity. I wrote a book. This is not that book. This is my friend trolling me. I do not have the man blob animal. This is my book. It's with O'Reilly. It's out now. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, and I'm really excited about it because it took me 2 years to write. So the conclusion, the best way to make your site compelling is by actually making it compelling. But wait, is there more? Thank you.